Hi everyone, I'm Daniel, and in this video we'll talk about another archetype for Arkham Horror the card game. This one revolves around how to take damage and or horror when you want to, and why you might want to do so instead of waiting around for treacheries or enemies to deal you damage and or horror when you least expect it. Anyways, let's dive in. I look through the card pool to find cards that deal you damage and or horror on command, usually during a player window or as part of the initiation of some other card's ability. I'll note that this isn't terribly common among player cards, but this happens quite often on locations or treacheries in play, so be on the lookout for that in almost every scenario. Several investigators don't mind taking damage and or horror, and can take advantage of doing so on their own terms. Another advantage is to use these cards to put damage or horror on particular assets when the time is right, especially to defeat them. I'd also like to mention that there are plenty of other ways to tank damage or horror, notably through getting attacked by enemies, so I'm restricting the cards here to ones that have very little to do with the presence of enemies. Of course, most of the cards here are in the Guardian and Survivor classes, which makes sense, they are the tankiest classes, but there's also a few in Mystic as well, and we'll see why with our example investigator coming up next. Let's say you're Agnes Baker, a strong core set investigator. Her ability is that whenever you've placed horror on her investigator card, you deal 1 damage to an enemy at her location. You'll want to trigger this often, and we'll talk about how in a bit, but you'll often find that she has horror on her, like this. She'll also likely have an Arcane Initiate in play, which enters play with 1 Doom on it. That Doom, of course, counts towards the overall Doom threshold on the agenda, so while the Arcane Initiate has an outstanding ability to draw you more cards, you'll need to dispose of it when you get a chance. But how? One option is to have a card like Smoking Pipe in play. During any player window, you can exhaust it to heal 1 horror from Agnes's card and take 1 damage, like this. That damage can be placed on any asset you control, including the Arcane Initiate. The Arcane Initiate is, of course, then defeated, and it leaves play along with the Doom. Bonus, you've also healed the horror from Agnes, so you can keep using her ability in the future without the fear of dying of horror. Okay, let's go through the enablers. We've just seen Smoking Pipe. Painkillers is the exact same, except for that you heal damage by taking horror. If you remember Agnes's ability, Painkillers can be a great way to deal 1 damage to any enemy at your location whenever you want. These cards are also an excellent way of moving horror and damage around on your assets. Remember that heal only means heal from your investigator card unless otherwise specified, and you cannot trigger them unless you have something to heal. These 2 cards cancel treachery cards, which is exceptionally powerful. This doesn't exactly happen when you want, but they're a good way to take some damage or horror if that's what you're looking for. There are also 2 upgraded versions of Ward of Protection. Let's look at some ways to take damage or horror to deal some damage. Blood Eclipse lets you take 1 to 3 damage to get some bonus skill value and deal bonus damage. The level 1 is just limited to taking 2 damage to deal 3 damage back. Meat Cleaver is a weapon that lets you take horror in order to deal +1 damage on an attack. This is extremely powerful as long as you have somewhere to put that horror. Thankfully, the card itself has a way to heal horror too. Here's a few more cards that do some miscellaneous things in exchange for taking the damage or horror, all during any player window, so you won't be spending any actions here. Forbidden Knowledge trades you a resource for a horror. Mysterious Raven nets you a single clue by being discarded. And Spirit of Humanity adds 2 blessed tokens into the bag in exchange for taking a damage and a horror and placing them somewhere. Next, we have a few ally cards that deal themselves damage or horror. These cards work a little bit different because you can't assign the damage someplace else, like in our example of trying to find a way to kill off the Arcane Initiate. However, as we'll see later, a few investigators are interested in any asset being defeated, including these folks, or don't mind some damage or horror on an ally to have something to heal. First, we have the level 2 Beat Cop, who has a great effect. 1 damage to any enemy at your location, even aloof ones, in exchange for a measly damage on him. Greta Wagner will take the damage after defeating an enemy in exchange for you discovering a clue. Her upgrade gives you another use and can grab a clue from a connecting location. Aquina, both her level 1 and level 3 versions, deal damage to enemies if you've been attacked, but each time you'll do this, you'll deal 1 horror to her. Field Agent is essentially the beat cop of clues, but she gets horror, and you can only do this twice before she is defeated, unless you heal her or increase her sanity. Agency Backup, which is a really expensive 5 XP ally, is kind of like a beat cop and Field Agent in one card, although you can only use one of the abilities at a time. Lastly, let's look at Solemn Vow, which is a fun enabler card for this archetype. Although you put up to 3 copies of it into your deck, you'll be playing it under another investigator's control. The benefit is that you can really move around damage or horror when you most want to. Let's look at an example. Let's say you're playing as Tommy Muldoon, who loves playing the tank archetype and wants his assets to be defeated so he can gain resources. This is, of course, even better and even faster if you can take damage for the whole team. Perhaps he's playing with Safina Rousseau, who only has 5 health. Tommy has a leather coat out already that has 1 damage on it, and he wants to get rid of it and help Safina out in the process. So they're at the same location. He'll put out a copy of Solemn Vow from his hand into Safina's play area. Next, Safina exhausts Solemn Vow to move 1 damage from her investigator card over to Tommy's leather coat, and that will defeat it, shuffling it back into his deck. Tommy gets the 2 resources, Safina feels a little bit better about surviving, and no one has even spent an action. Let's talk about 5 of the most likely investigators for this archetype. This is a little more important than usual because the investigator cards are mostly the payoff cards. Sure, Ward of Protection is nice, but for Agnes, the horror from playing Ward of Protection also means a damage onto an enemy at her location. Agnes's ability has a limit of once per phase, so you could deal 4 Tesla's damage in a round through, say, Ward of Protection during Mythos, Painkiller during the Investigator phase, an attack during the enemy phase, and perhaps Forbidden Knowledge during the player window in Upkeep. Remember, her ability only works if the horror is placed on her card, not other assets, so you do need to run some horror healing if you want this ability to keep working beyond a few rounds. One more way Agnes can take horror on command is by not playing Dark Memory. She'll take 2 horror at the end of her turn. Another way is on cards like Shriveling or Clairvoyance, which are spells that deal you horror if you draw a specific chaos token from the bag. I didn't include them in the main part of the video because they're too unreliable, but they are a great way to make use of her ability. Calvin Wright is next. He seems to pop up in most of these videos. He can't do much unless he has some damage and or horror on him to pump up his skill values. Even his Elder Sign has the ability to deal himself some direct damage or horror. He can take advantage of Mysterious Raven not just to get a clue, but taking the horror will help get his intellect to the point where he can use it to find more clues later. We've talked a little bit about Tommy Muldoon already. He can certainly take most of the cards on this list, and essentially his resource generation relies on defeating his own assets. His Elder Sign helps out with this archetype as well. It's also worth looking at Tommy's signature cards. First, his weakness. This is a very nasty weakness that threatens to undo all the hard work you've made towards defeating your assets. If this is still in your deck, you want to defeat your assets as quickly as possible, although you might want to leave 1 cheap asset out with damage on it, like a leather coat, just to make sure Rookie Mistake doesn't get shuffled back into your deck. The other payoff for Tommy is that if he doesn't want the resources from his ability, they can be used as ammo for his signature gun, Becky, instead. This is a fantastic reason to lean into this archetype. Finally, we have the 2 medics, Carolyn Fern and Vincent Lee. For Carolyn, taking horror is all about having something to heal. If she heals horror on an investigator or an ally, that card's controller gains a resource. There's no limit on this ability, so she and the team can be awash in resources quickly. That Forbidden Knowledge we saw earlier, take a horror to gain a resource. For Carolyn, you're really gaining 2 resources. Just make sure to put those resources to good use. Both medics also click when healing ally cards. Those Beat Cops and Field Agents, lasting forever is excellent on its own, but getting Carolyn or Vincent's bonus is even sweeter. For Vincent, his bonus is to give out On the Mend, when he heals damage from an investigator or ally. This is basically an unexpected courage that comes back to your hand every time you get healed. This of course includes Vincent himself, and he has a great way to deal himself damage, the bone saw. It's very much like the meat cleaver we saw earlier, but you take 1 damage to deal an extra damage for the attack. Now you'll have something to heal later. Alright, that's the end of this archetype guide. Playing around with damage and horror is actually quite fun. Turning something scary into something powerful is a great way to play the game. I hope you enjoyed looking at the cards and have some ideas for your next deck and campaign in Arkham Horror the card game. If you have some good ideas, leave them in the comments below, and feel free to check out some of my other Arkham Horror videos here on the channel. I'll see you in the next one.